Next, from Chicago, author William Crawford discusses the case behind the title of his book, Justice Perverted: How the Innocence Project at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism sent an innocent man to prison. This runs about 50 minutes.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank Russell and also members of the audience for dropping by to hear what it is I have to say. Just let me forewarn you that this is a tangled yarn, and I'm trying to keep it as simple as I can and as brief as I can, which is something of a challenge. Over the summer, Amica Press of Chicago published my nonfiction account titled Justice Perverted: How the Innocence Project at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism sent an innocent man to prison. The book, 205 pages or so, is a swift and easy read and a gripping page-turner, according to several reviews posted on Amazon. Yet at the same time, the book exposes a wrong that is moderately epic in scope, perhaps unprecedented. As the Chicago Tribune's Rick Kogan put it recently on his WGN program, After Hours, and I quote, "Were one to attempt to peddle this tale to a Hollywood producer, one would be met with an unqualified rejection. For the story on its face is unfathomable, unbelievable, stretching human reason to the snapping point, even by big screen standards. To give you some measure of the enormity of the wrong that was affected in this case, I must first read a short passage from Justice Perverted. Before I read that short passage, however, I must first give you a brief overview of my nonfiction account, just if you are to have a full appreciation of the excerpt's significance and the bizarre and frightful context in which it unfolds. Justice Perverted is a blow-by-blow account based solely on the underlying record of how David Protests, a once heralded, now disgraced, fired former professor at the Medill School of Journalism, masterminded a sinister charade that led to a monumental upending of justice in the Cook County criminal court system in 1999. Yet while Protest designed this sinister charade and choreographed it, it is noted that his wrongdoing never would have succeeded without the cooperation of certain witting and unwitting co-conspirators. The latter bunch include one, a small-time, gun-toting, licensed private investigator with a checkered past by the name of Paul Ciolino. Two, a dishonest, swindling, and hopelessly cunning and conflicted defense attorney by the name of Jack Rimland. Three, Tom Gaynor, at the time a politically compromising assistant prosecutor and witting tool of his then boss, Cook County State's Attorney Richard Levine. Four, a fawning press corps that became virtual cheerleaders for protests, sopping up and publishing his every sordid claim without checking whether the underlying record supported those claims. Last but not least, a handful of profoundly naive 20-something, adrenaline-filled protest students from upper-income backgrounds who wrongfully believed their professors' aims and goals were on the level. Because of this illegal conspiracy hatched and orchestrated by protests, a man by the name of Anthony Porter, an Illinois prison inmate who had been convicted of a 1982 double homicide in the Pool area of Washington Park on Chicago's South Side and sentenced to death, was summarily freed from prison in 1999 after spending 17 years on death row awaiting the arrival of the executioner. He was released by a Cook County criminal court judge at the request of then Cook County State's Attorney Richard Levine. Subsequently, Porter, who eventually was pardoned by then Governor George Ryan, went on to become a poster boy for anti-death penalty groups in Chicago and across the country. And because of this illegal conspiracy crafted and directed by protests, another man by the name of Elstory Simon, who had not a thing to do with the double homicide committed by the now freed Porter, was sentenced in 1999 to 37 years in prison for Porter's 1982 Pool double homicide. Getting important witnesses in all these cases to recant their testimony years later through promises to these critical witnesses that if they did recant their testimony, they would reap huge monetary rewards through book deals and movie rights. In some cases, they would receive shortened prison sentences. And yes, in some cases, they could even have sex with protesters' female students for a day or two. And in at least one of these cases corrupted by protests, evidence of physical violence comes into view. Charles Mcrainey, a key state witness who refused to go along with protests and changed the testimony he had given in the trial and conviction of the so-called Ford Heights Four men who had been convicted of one of the most horrific multiple rape and double homicide crimes imaginable. Not long after declining protesters' repeated assurances that he would reap huge monetary rewards if he did alter his testimony, an unknown gunman shot out a window of Mcrainey's home, the slug lodging in the wall only inches from the head of one of his sleeping infant sons. Days later, Charles Mcrainey and his family fled to Arkansas. A final note, largely due to my effort and those of a handful of others working together to expose this unparalleled injustice, including the indefatigable investigative work of Marty Pribe, a Chicago policeman and award-winning author who is with us in the audience tonight, Cook County State's Attorney Anita Alvarez on October 30 of last year went before the presiding criminal court judge of Cook County and asked that Elstory Simon, who had served 15 years of his 37-year sentence at that point, be freed from his incarceration. The judge granted Alvarez's request immediately. An hour later, during a packed press conference across from the Daly Center, Alvarez stated that the Porter-Simon case had been so hopelessly corrupted and so hopelessly corroded by Northwestern University, by Professor David Protess, by private investigator Paul Ciolino, and by defense attorney Jack Rimland, that justice compelled her to ask that Simon be freed. Two other comments before my reading. One, in 2011, Protess was summarily fired by Northwestern University following a 29-year career at Medill. In firing Protess, the university put out a lengthy statement, drawn up by the university's lawyers, to be sure, in which the university asserted that Protess was being let go for having lied to a Cook County criminal court judge during a hearing in yet another allegedly wrongful conviction case, for having lied to his own attorney in that case, for having lied to his Medill colleagues in that case, and for having withheld material evidence, altered material evidence, and mischaracterized material evidence in that unrelated case. And two, not long after Elstory Simon was released from prison, Simon's attorneys filed a 50-page lawsuit in federal court on the 19th floor of 219 South Dearborn Street against Northwestern, against Protess, against Ciolino, and against Rimland. The suit seeks $40 million in damages for their sinister, unlawful, and brazen roles in sending Simon to prison for a decade and a half. It is worth noting that a principal theory underlying the lawsuit is this: that the university regularly looked the other way as Protess worked his black art of overturning or attempting to overturn criminal convictions year in and year out. This was due in part because protesters' success in freeing the wrongfully convicted was bringing fame and fortune to Medill. What, with aspiring would-be journalists from around the country standing in line to gain entry to Medill and to enroll in one of protesters' classes. As for money, there is this. The suit notes that in 1999, the very year protests engineered Porter's wrongful freedom and Simon's wrongful incarceration, the Mccormick Foundation sat down and cut a check to Medill for $20 million. That $20 million check was in addition to the hundreds of thousands of dollars pouring into Medill coffers from various foundations year after year after year, such as the Alphawood Foundation here in Chicago, which sent Medill donations of between $100,000 and $200,000 every year for nearly a decade. Before reading the selected passage from my book, additional background is in order. And this is where things really get screwy, and you can't really put it together until you read the book. The passage describes in some detail how an armed member of protesters' team, Paul Cialino, and an armed Cialino associate, who had no affiliation at all with NU, all but kicked in the front door of Elstory Simon's Milwaukee home on an early wintry morning in 1999, and through sleights of hand, threats of violence, and other incredible subterfuges, extracted a video statement from Elstory Simon, a statement that had been written out by Cialino and videotaped by Cialino. In that videotaped statement, Simon now asserts, for the first time in 17 years, that he, in fact, was the triggerman behind the 1982 Washington Park pool homicide. And just 3 days before Simon gave his videotaped confession, protests, 3 of his students, and Cialino drove to Milwaukee and obtained a videotaped statement from Inez Simon, Elstory Simon's long estranged wife, who lived a couple of blocks away from her husband in Milwaukee, a crack addict and alcoholic who supported her addictions by turning tricks. Inez, who ultimately would die of AIDS for the first time in 17 years after the pool homicides, also claimed in her videotape that Elstory, in fact, was the Washington Park killer. Excuse me. What protester students did not know when they obtained the videotaped Inez statement is that earlier, through a third party, Protest had worked his black magic yet again. He had promised Inez that if she changed her story and fingered Elstory Simon as the real pool killer, Protest would get her son, Sonny Jackson, and her nephew, Walter Jackson, out of prison early, where both were serving long stretches for murder. In addition, Inez was told by Protest that she would receive a huge amount of money from movie deals and book deals for her recantation, as would her jailed nephew and son. Now, if I may, I'm going to read one of the more significant but less unbelievable events that occurred, and those events surround the extraction of the confession of Elstory Simon, a confession which would have been thrown out of court by any judge anywhere in America on one simple motion. So the excerpt is as follows. Minutes after the sun came up on February 3, 1999, a Wednesday, 5 days after an emaciated, weakened Inez Jackson had recorded her video from Brookfield, Wisconsin, Elstory Simon, naked from the waist up, began nodding off, exhausted from a night of snorting cocaine and drinking booze in his home in Milwaukee with his late girlfriend, Pearl Russ. Barely conscious, Simon was awakened from his stupor about 6:30 a.m. by 2 men, armed with guns, who identified identified themselves as, quote, police investigators from Illinois. They accused Simon of having murdered 2 individuals years earlier in the pool area of Chicago's Washington Park. The uninvited guests, Robert Cialino and his assistant, Arnold Reed, told Simon that Inez, quote, and witnesses, close quote, had signed statements alleging that Simon had indeed committed the murders. Despite protestations from Simon that the 2 men were, quote, crazy, and that they leave his house at once, Simon said the 2 so-called police investigators from Chicago then slapped a video into a portable player. As the tape rolled, a black male appeared on the screen, claiming to have been a witness to the 1982 Washington Park slayings of Marilyn Green and Jerry Hillard. The unidentified man, who much later would be revealed as an actor hired and scripted by Cialino, said Simon was the trigger man. Simon's intruders had another persuasive trick to play. After showing the video and producing a copy of Inez's signed affidavit and that of Walter Jackson, also incriminating Simon, Cialino did the seemingly impossible. The private eye glanced into a mirror hanging on Simon's wall, and by apparent coincidence spotted a news report flashing across Simon's TV, which otherwise was not within sight. Cialino signaled Simon to get out of his chair and watch the newscast. The TV was tuned to Milwaukee's Channel 50, a locally owned CBS station, and it was rebroadcasting the January 29th story in which Inez is seen and heard asserting that Simon had indeed committed the murders. There on the screen was the gaunt-looking Inez, stating she saw Simon shoot the victim, Inez's affidavit alleging the same, and breakaways featuring still photos of protests, the bearded choreographer who coordinated Cialino's visit with the Milwaukee broadcast. Cialino described Simon's reaction to the newscast this way, quote, and I looked into a mirror on the wall and I seen the beginning of the CBS network story that had been on the previous evening news. They were playing it again. This is about 7:30 or 7:40 a.m. And me and El Story walked over to the TV, and there was the whole story, about 3.5 minutes of why El Story Simon committed the murder on network news. And El Story is sitting there watching it, and he's staring at it, and he's listening to the whole thing. So everything that I just told him about the media, he's seeing it for himself now. And I had no idea this was on. He had no idea it was coming on. It just happened. The surreal events unfolding around Simon that morning in his own home triggered a well of fear within. Quote, Cialino kept telling me that they had all the evidence they needed to convict me, El Story later attested. Quote, that I was going to go down for these murders and end up on death row, and there was nothing I could do about it. Seeing this story on the TV, I was no longer just angry, I was scared to death. For the first time, I believed that I was actually going to be charged with committing the murders. Cialino told Simon that all protest wanted was to free Porter, that when Porter got out, millions of dollars would be flying around from book deals, Hollywood movies, and the like. And Simon would be sharing in the bounty. Simon had to move quickly, however, because Chicago police were on their way to Milwaukee at that very moment to arrest Simon and return him to Chicago in chains to face the double murder charge. Quote, he, Cialino, convinced me that he was actually trying to help me by giving me a way out before the police got to my house to arrest me. He said that if I gave a statement saying I did the crimes in self-defense, that he would get me a free lawyer, that the professor would make it so I would only serve a short time in prison, and that when I got out, I'd be taken care of financially and would not have to work again. If Simon agreed and confessed, Cialino promised Simon that a Chicago lawyer, a veteran member of the defense bar by the name of Jack Rimond, would take Simon's case and Cialino would pay for it. and Rimland would take it free of charge. All the defendant had to do was plead guilty, but, and it was a major league but, he had to extend a personal apology to Green's mother and to Porter. That was key. Simon had to extend the apology for the deal to go through. Cialino said that Protest, a respected professor who wielded immense clout back in Chicago, would see to it that if Simon pleaded guilty and extended the apologies, the resulting prison sentence would be short, no more than a 2-year stretch. It was an ironclad guarantee. And here's why it made sense to Simon. When Simon finished doing his time, just 24 months, Cialino assured him there would be millions of dollars waiting for him on the outside. Again, book deals and Hollywood movies that would generate so much money, Simon would never have to work another day in his life. Simon again erupted in anger, again professing his innocence, again declaring the whole thing was crazy. At that point, Simon alleged Cialino, quote, put his hand on his gun and said that we could do this the easy way or we could do it the hard way, but either way, I was going to give a statement. Cialino also told Simon, according to court documents, quote, people have accidents in their homes all the time, and Simon could very well have one that morning. Up all night, the effects of booze and cocaine tapering off, Simon caved. He signed a statement prepared by Cialino declaring that he had killed Hillard because Hillard was going for a weapon, and Green, accidentally, because she had gotten in the way. Remarkably, at Cialino's direction, Simon rehearsed a confession prepared earlier by Cialino. Equally remarkably, Simon then donned a t-shirt at Cialino's request, took a seat in a living room easy chair, and after Cialino pulled out his video equipment and rolled the tape, Simon solemnly read the confession that had been scripted by Cialino. That evening, February 3, 1999, CBS Channel 2 in Chicago aired the taped confession, sending members of the press and public howling with indignation mixed with disbelief. In a July 2002 Chicago Magazine article, Cialino gave the following explanation of how he's able to extract the Simon confession. Quote, we just bull rushed him, and mentally he couldn't recover, according to the magazine piece. Cialino added that Cialino had, quote, danced to the edge in getting Simon to confess, acknowledging that the witness in the Cialino tape actually was an employee of the detective. The following day, Al Story Simon, sitting in the back seat of his sister's car, was driven to Chicago, where, accompanied by his attorney, Jack Rimland, who was hired by Cialino and paid by Cialino, he surrendered to police and to Tom Gaynor, who is now an associate criminal court judge, a Cook County assistant state's attorney at the station house at 51st Street and Wentworth Avenue. Following an appearance before a judge, he was ordered locked up where he would remain until sentencing, which was 6 months away. I'm finished with the reading, but I want to just mention this. This is a journalism class. If that is so, if in fact this is a journalism class, then I ask you to ask yourselves, where are the students as this frightful event is unfolding? Where is Professor Protest as this extended and unlawful act takes place? Is he standing next to the chalkboard in his classroom in Fisk Hall? Is this illegal act taking place at 1 p.m. or 2 p.m. in a classroom in Fisk Hall on the Evanston campus? Or is it taking place in Simon's Milwaukee home at 6:30 in the morning in the presence of 2 armed men posing as Chicago police when the students are back in their dorms 90 miles to the south getting ready for school? And what is the title of this segment of the Innocence Project class? Is it titled The Ins and Outs and the Fine Art of Extracting an illegal double murder confession from an innocent man? And since when does a private eye, who once threatened to put a bullet in the head of a Midlothian man who was hassling one of Cialino's clients and who never graduated from college, become an adjunct professor at Medill? And since when does an adjunct professor at Medill wield a loaded pistol and other threats of physical harm to get at the truth? Indeed, does Cialino subsequently lecture the students on how he threatened Simon with physical harm and the death penalty and promised him untold riches would come his way if he confessed to the 1982 killings? Does Cialino later lecture the students in Fisk Hall on the fine art of using firearms to extract illegal confessions? And if so, does that lecture contain instruction by Cialino on how these students should load and shoot the gun if necessary? I could go on. In closing, I add this. I used to teach journalism at virtually every university in the Chicago area, at Medill, both undergraduate and postgraduate, at Roosevelt, Columbia College, DePaul, and Loyola universities. And I can tell you with surety, it never occurred to me or any of my supervisors to rely on the wiles and illegal intrigues of a private eye with nothing more than an associate degree from a local junior college who once threatened to put a bullet in the head of a South Suburban man to assist me in my teaching responsibilities. And thank you. Yes?
What brought you to the story?
You know, I've done 10 or 15 of these things, and that's the first question. And so what happened is, I'll keep it brief, a dear friend had called me probably 4 or 5 years ago. He had a Chicago police friend. The Chicago police friend had gotten jammed up. The Chicago police friend had been accused of beating a confession out of a guilty man. I said, I'll be happy to sit down and talk with him. I sat down with a policeman. He told me what had happened. It's another story, kind of like. And I said, that sounds very interesting. Where are all the records? He responded by saying that all the records are in the hands of 2 retired federal ATF agents, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms agents. And they are now retired. They're licensed private eyes. All the records are in their possession in their offices in Batavia, Illinois. I went out there, introduced myself. I said, may I take a look at the XYZ files? They said, yes, but you're looking at the wrong case. I came back 3 or 4 times, 5 times, to pick up more trials in the ABC case. Each time I went back, Jimmy DeLorto, one of the agents, said, happy to help, Bill, you're looking at the wrong case. Finally, I said, what case do I look at? Tell me this one.
Yeah, you described this very eloquently, Bill, about what happened at Northwestern, and you talk about looking at other cases. In your opinion, is this the only instance in which there was some kind of fraud or misconduct in the wrongful conviction movement? Or do you think this is sort of emblematic of what's happening in a lot of these cases?
Well, you know, again, my response to that is based on the underlying record. It is not my opinion. In the $50 or $40 million federal lawsuit that was brought against these 4 people, Northwestern, protests, and the 2 others, there is a whole section of that lawsuit devoted to the allegation that this case does not stand alone, that at least 4 or 5 other cases had been similarly corrupted by protests, and again, an ever-evolving, changing set of students as time went by, all of whom thought it was on the level. So no, this does not stand alone. It's like he infected at least, and this is not my opinion. In the federal lawsuit, it asserts very clearly that in at least 5 other cases, he had similarly corrupted them. Yes?
You keep saying the federal lawsuit alleges and asserts. Have any of these facts been found to be true by a jury or a judge?
Of course not. It's a lawsuit. And before a jury can make any such decision, yeah, they're all allegations. There's no question about it. But it's not allegations with regard to L. Story Simon. With regard to offering sex for basic witnesses to change their testimony, to bring it in line with protesters, I've got the records. And if you want to come out to Naperville, I'll be happy to fax them to you. Those are not allegations. Yes?
So how do you reconcile those facts with the work that places like Medill Justice Project or the Exoneration Project at UChicago are doing? That's obviously very important. Is this the work of an individual, that professor at Medill, that obviously made these horrible actions, or is that like a trend that we should be wary of? Like, what's the solution there? How do you view that?
I don't know what the solution is, but here's the thing. Here's one thing I want to make very, very clear. And my detractors at Medill, my detractors among the legacy press in Chicago are many, and they have attacked me unrelentingly for having written this book. Guess what? No lawsuit, but a libel lawsuit. But what I would say very clearly, this is not a pro-death penalty story. This is not an anti-death penalty story. I frankly don't care one way or the other about that. I give it some thought from time to time when some man is about to die in a couple of hours, and I suppose I flip from one side to the other. That's not this book. This is a book about how one man created the charade, corrupted the system, and brought about one of the great injustices in the history of Cook County. But it's got nothing to do with being pro-death penalty or anti-death penalty. Secondly, I would make this point. There is an association of innocence projects. They're everywhere now. Practically every university has one. And guess, shortly after he got fired by the university, he turned around within hours and opened up what initially was called the Chicago Innocence Project, acronym CHIP. He had that for about a year, doing the same thing that he was doing at Northwestern. He has now changed it to I believe it's the Chicago Innocence Center. It works down in the Loop. But the point is that, again, this is not a pro-death penalty or an anti-death penalty. But the point I want to make about protest is this. There is an association of innocence projects all across the country. Practically every major university has got one. Guess who they booted out of their association? Largely because of this book. He's no longer in it. He's operating. He's pretending he's helping out whatever he's doing. But he was summarily booted from the Association of Innocence Projects. Yes?
Well, first of all, congratulations.
Well, thank you.
I can't imagine how many hours you and others. I guess two questions. How would they pick Simon as their target? And have any of these people been punished?
That's an excellent question. So when Alvarez, it was becoming very clear that she was going to go before the chief criminal court judge in Cook County and ask for the release of Simon. What was your question?
Well, how they pick Simon and any of the people protesting others who were in on this?
Okay. As to the latter half of that question, the question among a small group of us who started working on this thing, Marty included, the big question was, how is Alvarez going to handle this thing? Because Tom Gaynor, and I don't care where Tom Gaynor sits today, he's an associate criminal court judge. Why he's still there, I do not know, and I wish he were in this room right now. But the big question in our mind was, how is Anita Alvarez going to explain in a very comprehensive way how this evil could ever have come into being? And there were two individuals that were absolutely essential for this thing to work in Protest's favor. One was Gaynor, And all you got to do is read the book, and you're going to see that Gaynor was in possession of information that proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Porter was guilty, and that information proves without a reasonable doubt that Elsori Simon was innocent. Therefore, one would think Anita Alvarez would call her press conference and say, and by the way, yes, there was Rimland, yes, there was Porter, yes, there was Northwestern University, yes, there was Cialino, and yes, there was Gaynor, but we never heard about Gaynor. You know who else we didn't hear about? Dick Devine. And it's at home, and anybody who wants me to fax a copy, I'll be happy to fax it to them. But there is a document written by a man who was in the state's attorney's office at the time, who claims in a sworn affidavit, 7 pages long, that Devine intentionally railroaded this man for political reasons.
One more question, Bill. Getting to this gentleman's question, from a storytelling point of view, can you describe how influential the exoneration of Porter was? I mean, I believe he said in the book this was in 1999 that Porter was let out, and then in 2003, Governor Ryan pardoned 4 more guys on death row. And yet, if I understand the narrative correctly, all 4 of these guys who were on death row had lost all their criminal cases and all their appeals. They had repeatedly been determined to be guilty, and then Ryan let out these 4 men from death row, one of them who killed 7 people in a fire. Do you think that could have taken place without the Porter taking place first?
No.
Well, so can you extrapolate on that? How is it that a state could let out Porter for a double homicide, and then let out 4 other, then a governor who's about to be convicted on 21 counts of his own? Explain that. How many murderers have been set free?
I have no idea. What one has to do to kind of get a handle on this thing is go back and look at what was going on in 1998 and 1999. And there was a lemming effect, a steamrolling effect that was going on. And Devine couldn't do anything right. His prosecutors couldn't do anything right. At that just prior to Porter's release, the Tribune came out. I used to work at the Tribune, and they came out with a 5-part series, and it absolutely blistered Devine, prosecutors in general, not just in the Midwest, on both coasts. It went on and on and on. Had some of the crudest anecdotes you can possibly imagine. So there was a certain climate. But you know what? There's something else going on in the press today, and I don't have to tell you folks this, but it's worth mentioning. When I started at the Chicago Tribune, it was nothing. I was on a special unit, investigative unit at the time. It was nothing for the city editor to come back and say, hey, look, we've got a big time issue. It's going to take a while to get to the bottom of it. There are 4 of you on the team. I want you to take 6 months, and I want you to get to the bottom of this thing, and we'll do a 5-part series. That doesn't happen. At the Tribune today, when I was there, 800 was the magic number. There were 800 reporters, 800 editors, 800 copy editors in total. They're down to something like 300 now. All these records that I examined were out in Itasca and Batavia. That's 30 miles away. I mean, people actually got to get into cars. They got to spend money on fuel. They got to spend 3 and 4 months to do this. Number one, there's barely room in the newspaper for these kind of stories anymore. We do 5-part stories. They start on Sunday. They last till Friday. You know, it's just a different era. The money isn't there. Half of these legacy organizations are in bankruptcy. So it's pretty easy to pick up the phone and call a protest and get a nice fat quote out of them and run the story without looking into it.
newspaper industry today. However, did you prior to the publication of the book, did you ever go to any of these newspapers and lay out the facts?
James, that's a great question. It's something that I've left out here. But when I first came across this, and this is worthy of mention, when I first came across this one set of documents, which proves beyond any doubt what happened here, I put together a report which is 35,000 words long. It's 100 pages, and its title is Chimera. When I was finished with that, I emailed Chimera to just about every human being on the face, certainly of the nation, that I thought might have some interest in writing, which was clearly a terrible, terrible wrong. It went to former U.S. attorneys, many of whom at one time or another were friends of mine. It went to leading defense attorneys. It went to leading assistant prosecutors. It went to every member of the press in the Midwest, both coasts, New York Times, LA Times, Chicago Tribune. Jim, not a peep. And one of the reasons is these news organizations were so invested on the other side of this issue that they failed to even recognize the fact that I put this thing out. Then, when this was met with complete and utter silence and some hostility by the press, I figured maybe I give it some cloak of decency. So I go to Amica Press. They were kind enough to not only publish the book, but prior to its publication, they helped me immensely in the editing process. And the book, now that it was a book and it wasn't just some internet rambling out there by somebody that nobody even knew, now it's in book form and it can actually be gotten on Amazon. It's enjoyed some brisk sales, and it accomplished the end that we set out to accomplish. But simply operating on the internet alone didn't do anything. Yes.
What could that Cialino have said to Simon to make him think that actually confessing and admitting guilt, even though he was supposedly going to get out in 2 years, that there was going to be some money and fame in doing that? I'm having a hard time getting that to add up.
Well, let me just give you one other little anecdote. In another case, in the Ford Heights case, they've long been convicted. They're in jail, sentenced to long, two to die, 2 are in for life. Cialino and protests call up Charles Mcrainey, who's the government's most important sole witness in the Ford Heights 4 case. His testimony is that he was in his house, looked out the window, saw the 4 men marching the 2 victims into a dilapidated home next door. He testified to that. The Ford Heights 4 are convicted. So now Protests gets to him. Protests and Cialino, if you're ready for this one, they show up at a Kentucky Fried Chicken, I believe it was, in Kankakee. And Charles Mcrainey shows up. And I'm not going to remember the name now. Cialino is posing, thank you very much, is posing as Jerry Bruckheimer, who at the time he's a Hollywood producer, and he had something like $6 billion in ticket sales under his belt at that point. Protests and Cialino sit down across from Charles Mcrainey, and Protest says, "Meet Jerry Bruckheimer." Cialino is dressed to the nines. Cialino's got a copy of the movie contract. Cialino shoves it across the table and said, "You're going to get $250,000 just for signing. You're going to get a percentage of the proceeds once the movie is out. And you can frolic with some of Protest's students. And Mcrainey, God bless him, he's not in good health. At the time, I'm told he was a religious man and an honest man. And he said, why would I do something like that? He got up and he left.
Jeff, right over there.
Yes.
Hi. Member of the audience, not a bookseller at this moment. At the beginning of your remarks, you suggested, without I think saying it explicitly, that Northwestern University was complicit in this. And they're the target of the lawsuit at the same time, suggesting that other people feel the same way. In your opinion, after the review of so much of the documentation reflected in this book, is it your opinion that Northwestern was duped by or complicit with protests for gain through their development operation, or would you prefer not to speculate?
No, I think it's a slight combination. Number one, I don't think there's any question that they were sort of duped. I don't believe that any of the higher-ups were in any way complicit in this. But what I did say in these remarks here, and I believe it strongly, the very year that this upending of justice occurs, the Mccormick Foundation cuts the Medill $25 million. Meanwhile, all these other charitable foundations are cutting these enormous checks. The Alphawood Foundation, 100 to 200,000. It's on the Attorney General's website. So I'm not going to put thoughts in anybody's heads, but you know, I'm the head of the Medill School, and $25 million is coming in, and this guy's working his magic, and he's getting nothing but good press. He was an absolute icon, an absolute hero. It's a little tough to walk away from that, but I have uncovered not one shred of evidence that anybody, anywhere, at the university, at a level higher than protests, was somehow encouraging this or going along with it. As a matter of fact, there's a dean up there. There was a former dean up there by the name of Dean Levine, and he was there for about 3 years. And Dean Levine had a terrible time with protests. They had a terrible relationship. Dean Levine had his own problems, and that's in my book. But he and protests, they were not buddies, and I think Levine wanted more than anything to get rid of protests, and he ultimately did.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.